On the 18th of August, 1644, Mazarin wrote to Alexandre de Prouville, Marquis de Tracy, Maréchal de Camp in the French army serving in Germany. Referring to the recent three-day battle of Fribourg fought by the Duc d'Enghien and Maréchal Turenne against the Bavarian army, Mazarin commented that it was peut-être la plus grande victoire du siècle. Mazarin's comment is striking for two reasons. In the first case, contemporaries and historians think of Rocroi the year before as the greatest victory of the 1640s. In comparison, Fribourg is relatively unknown. Secondly, Fribourg was a bloodbath for the French troops, who suffered massive casualties in a series of direct attacks on well-prepared Bavarian positions. It could readily be seen as a tactical defeat on the battlefield itself. But the French action forced the Bavarian commander, Franz Mercy, to fall back to secure his lines of retreat. The surviving French forces abandoned the Bavarians and turned north to conduct a rapid campaign along the Rhine, where they captured the key fortress of Philippsburg and swept into the cities of Mainz, Oppenheim, and Speyer, transforming France's strategic position on the Middle Rhine. For Mazarin, this was a strategic breakthrough that finally offered the prospect of military success in the empire. The Battle of Fribourg is perhaps emblematic of the ambiguous history of the French military campaigns in the empire from 1643 to 48, which combined some remarkable military successes with equally dramatic setbacks. And the military campaigns in the empire, above all the detailed correspondence between Mazarin and the commander of the army in Germany from 1644, Maréchal Turenne, provide an insight into Mazarin's political and military thinking and priorities. The German campaigns, I'll argue, demonstrate two sides of Mazarin's statesmanship. The first is his remarkable appetite and ability for managing the detailed business of government, in this case, the military operations to support his commanders in the field. Mazarin's capacity to deal with the fine-grained detail of government administration was quite remarkable, far more extensive than Richelieu, who left large areas of finance, military administration, even diplomacy to his subordinates. However, the German campaigns also show another side to Mazarin's statesmanship, one which runs somewhat against the praise that the cardinal customarily receives as a master of the conduct of foreign policy. For Mazarin, the military campaigns of his commanders were subordinated to his own conception of grand strategy, the integration of military and diplomatic policy, an area in which he considered himself the undisputed expert and arbiter. However, his interventions in successive campaigns, dictated by his overall strategic priorities, were far from uniformly successful. A case can certainly be made that Mazarin's interventions prevented a more decisive military outcome around 1646 and protracted the war in Germany. Initially, however, Mazarin acted decisively to recover a military situation in the empire that seemed, by the end of 1643, almost to be a lost cause. Yet his actions and interventions also reveal a longer-term set of assumptions at the highest level of French government about the character of the troops and the officers in the army of Germany. These assumptions concerned the extent to which the army needed support from the French crown, comparable with that provided for other armies in France's war against the Habsburgs. And this, in turn, throws light on the complex relationship with France's major military partner in the Holy Roman Empire, the Crown of Sweden. First of all, we need to go back in time very briefly. The 1634 defeat of the Swedish and German Protestant army at Nördlingen was followed in 1635 by France's open war against the Habsburgs, and it offered Cardinal Richelieu the opportunity to hire into French service the largest remnant of the defeated Swedish army, the German regiments serving under the command of their military enterpriser, Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar. In the dark days of the later 1630s, the campaigns of Saxe-Weimar on the Rhine and in Thuringia and Franconia offered some good news amidst French military setbacks elsewhere. But this came at a price. Saxe-Weimar was first and foremost a military enterpriser operating his army in pursuit of profit and personal ambition. He felt only modestly bound by France's strategic goals. The crisis point came after Saxe-Weimar's successful capture of the Rhine fortress of Breisach in late 1638, when it became obvious that he had no intention of handing the place over to a French garrison. The immediate crisis was averted by Weimar's sudden death in July 1639. But a perhaps greater problem from acquiring Saxe-Weimar's army was a long-term resentment and distrust it sowed in France's political and military ally. Stripping Sweden of its most experienced force of German colonels and their regiments at the point of Sweden's greatest weakness in the empire was not readily forgiven by Swedish ministers and military commanders. In 1639, and despite strong Swedish counteroffers, the French were able to negotiate with the 4 directors nominated in Saxe-Weimar's will and to retain the services of the army following their commander's death. But again, it proved a difficult relationship. The Duc de Longueville and then Maréchal Guébriant sought to keep the directors and the individual German colonels under French control. There was some evidence by 1642 that Guébriant had achieved a degree of control over the Weimarian colonels and had blended them to some extent with the newly contracted German regiments. But any gains from the previous year were snatched back in 1643. A considerably strengthened Bavarian army, reinforced with imperial troops, seized the initiative, pushing the army of Germany onto the defensive and threatening to drive them back across the Rhine. Guébriant, whose forces were reduced by desertion and casualties to around 6,000 troops, only 6,000 troops, in later 1643, was killed on campaign in November, and a few weeks later, the army of Germany was ambushed as it entered winter quarters around Tuttlingen and all but wiped out. This was the German situation that Mazarin had inherited as he started to exercise his ministerial authority in the name of the Queen Regent and the young Louis XIV. He was faced with the need to find a new commander for the army, to ransom a portion of the senior officers captured at Tuttlingen, and to initiate the recruitment of what would be a virtually new army of Germany. Mazarin's background and experience might suggest a focus on military campaigns in the south, in Piedmont and across the Pyrenees, and indeed a reduction of the German theatre to a simple set of defensive frontier garrisons. Yet an important document preserved in the Archives des Affaires étrangères points to the opposite view. A memoir written towards the end of 1643, it makes a powerful case for focusing military resources on the empire. The principal axis of France's war, it argues, should now be the German lands, for it's only thanks to the military pressure of the Austrians and Bavarians that Spain is able to maintain her military struggle against France and face off the rebellions in Catalonia and Portugal. The French should create an army large and experienced enough to strike deep into the empire and not, as it says, s'amuser dans les pays ruinés proches du Rhin, where the army, it argues, risks being wasted away. It should move instead along the Danube, entering Bavaria. This should be the principal goal of the French, for the Bavarian elector would prefer to abandon the interests of the House of Austria than to see his own territory devastated. Whether or not Mazarin was sent this document or saw it, the ideas certainly seem to have informed his decision-making and strategic prioritization in 1644 and 1645. Turenne's military career in the Italian theatre from the late 1630s had brought him to the attention of Mazarin, who was far more prepared to overlook the conspiratorial activities of Turenne's brother, the Duc de Bouillon, than Richelieu had been. Granted his marshal's baton in November 1643, Turenne was dispatched to command the army of Germany in January 1644. Turenne's instructions were to use the recent military disaster at Tuttlingen to try to break the hold that the Weimarian directors had over the rest of the army and do all possible to reduce the German units to shared terms of service and obedience to the crown. The challenge was considerable. The directors and the other German colonels continued to serve the French crown as military contractors, whose property rights in their regiments were recognized and accepted. In return for these property rights and a high level of administrative and judicial autonomy independence, the colonels, in turn, assumed a considerable financial risk. They met a proportion of the costs of recruiting and maintaining their units. Behind this financial risk undertaken by the colonels was the expectation that the army would be managed to ensure an adequate financial return on its military operations. For most armies operating during the 30 Years' War in the Holy Roman Empire, this meant a combination of taxes, the so-called contributions, extorted from territory where the army was occupied or within range of its garrisons and raiding parties. These were often collected as well during the 3 to 4 months when the army was quartered during the winter. But the other element of this was that during the months of actual campaigning, say from May to October, the army would need to draw heavily on local sources of supply, food for the soldiers, especially forage for the cavalry horses. Military operations need to be driven by this logistical requirement to obtain supplies from the areas where they were to operate. This gave armies and warfare a very different character from the campaigns, for example, that French armies fought in Flanders or in Piedmont. In these areas, supply convoys and magazines sustained armies containing large numbers of infantry supported by trains of artillery, whose primary aim was to push slowly and systematically into the enemy borderlands and to undertake sieges there. In contrast, in Germany, the army since the later 1630s had evolved into primarily cavalry-based forces, both chevaux légers and dragons, pursuing campaigns that prioritized mobility and avoided extended static operations like sieges, which greatly increased the problems of supply from the localities. Rapid wars of maneuver, pushing deep into enemy-held territory, were much more typical in Germany. Mazarin and the French ministers were well aware of all of this. On the one hand, they knew that the German colonels would be reluctant to allow their regiments, their personal investment, if you like, to be lost through any shortfalls of promised funding from the French crown. Faced with that, they would find ways to keep their troops in service, whether through local extortion, local taxes, or if necessary, even using their own money and credit to keep their units in being. On the other hand, Mazarin clearly believed that because of this potential for self-sufficiency, the prospect of some direct financial support from the French crown, even if well below initial promises, should still have a considerable influence on the operations and commitment of the Army of Germany. If tens of millions of livres per year were required to sustain the French military operations in Flanders or Italy or Catalonia, the Army of Germany offered the attractive possibility of successful campaigns sustained for a fraction of that cost to the French treasury. In early July 1644, Mazarin wrote to Turenne that he must think about ways to support his army that involved as little as possible burden on the royal finances. Mazarin stressed the exhaustion of the royal treasury and the difficulty of getting taxes collected in France, though this he didn't say, of course, didn't prevent high levels of funding being sent to other French armies. Various problems immediately presented themselves. After Tuttlingen, the army of Germany had been dangerously weakened. Unable to remain east of the Rhine, the remainder of the troops had been billeted in Lorraine, already devastated by a decade of warfare and unable to provide more than the most basic subsistence. Those regiments which had survived had seen their operational strength much reduced. New units need to be raised to boost up the overall size of the army. In this case, mere promises of funding would not be enough. Existing colonels and new German enterprisers were invited to raise additional troops, but they expected some real money, some cash, as promised in the contracts, before they'd start recruitment and mustering. As the shortfalls in the promised funds mounted, so the delays and failures of the recruitment contracts multiplied. The numbers of troops raised fell far short of Turenne hopes if he were to resume the offensive and cross the Rhine to allow his troops to subsist in territory that was richer and more able to provide war taxes. One response was to try to boost numbers by transferring existing French regiments to the Army of Germany, but this brought limited success. Turenne wrote of one regiment whose soldiers were so reluctant to move to the army that he said that it would be better not to force the issue and to send them to another army. Mazarin made a particular point of sending his personal regiment of Cavalerie Royale Italienne to the army of Germany, but did so by lavishly funding it above the levels of the rest of the army. Mazarin's own frustration that payment of 10 montres over a year, the German units were lucky to get 3, seemed to produce very limited results in terms of the operational effectiveness of this unit, and it was a view echoed by Turenne. Indeed, the assumption in all of Turenne's correspondence was that the German troops, especially the long-serving ones, were far more resilient. In August 1644, Turenne wrote that the Germans in the army are worth 4 times the number of French troops. And I quote him, "La fatigue d'ici est sans comparaison plus grande que celle d'aucune des armées de France." But the necessary German recruits were not arriving in large enough numbers. The enemy Bavarian army was powerful, and thanks to good winter quarters, had been growing in strength. Turenne was convinced that he lacked the military force to push into areas of Germany where the army would be less dependent on the trickle of French finance currently being made available. And Turenne was more and more convinced that Mazarin's real priority was Flanders, where Gaston d'Orléans and the Duc d'Enghien were vying for control of a massive campaign army. Mazarin certainly hoped for success in Flanders, but he also had to contend with the increasingly tense relationship between the victor of Rocroi, Enghien, and his cousin, the king's uncle. As it became obvious that poor preparation and lackluster leadership from Gaston made it unlikely that the French would achieve more than the capture of Gravelines in the course of the 1644 campaign, so Mazarin responded to Enghien's pressure for a chance to win another success with his own army by simply dispatching Enghien and a large body of troops from Flanders to rendezvous with Turenne for a joint military operation in Germany. Well, the outcome of this operation, the Battle of Fribourg and its consequences, I mentioned at the beginning of the paper. It produces this dramatic success. For Mazarin, as I said, this was vindication for making a heavy military commitment to Germany. France now had this open gate to the Middle Rhine to pursue subsequent campaigns into central Germany. And it was the success of this 1644 military operation, the close cooperation between the hyper-aggressive Enghien and the more cautious and experienced Turenne, that persuaded Mazarin to repeat the combination of forces in 1645, after Turenne suffered an initial defeat at Herbsthausen on the 5th of May. Once again, the additional troops brought by Enghien and the good working relationship between the two commanders transformed the situation. Turenne and Enghien marched east through Franconia and headed towards Bavaria. They were engaged by the Bavarian army, which had taken up well-prepared positions around Allerheim. Once again, Enghien's willingness to run high risks in a direct assault on the entrenched Bavarian army was supported by the initially more cautious Turenne. As at Fribourg, Enghien's tactics were hugely costly, some 4,000 dead and wounded in the French army. And again, the French victory was not so much a direct defeat for the Bavarians, who suffered fewer casualties, but was a defeat because it forced a Bavarian retreat in which their troops became demoralized and resistance collapsed. The French went on to capture Nördlingen and were set to invade Bavaria when Enghien fell ill and retired back to France. Turenne, left with a much reduced army, which Mazarin refused to reinforce, now Enghien had departed, now confronted a powerful combined Bavarian imperial army that had reconstituted itself. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Turenne was forced back into Alsace, abandoning his conquests in the heart of Germany and the hope of sustaining the army beyond the devastated frontier territories. And there was also, I think, a price to be paid for these joint military campaigns, which went beyond their ultimately disappointing operational outcome. Mazarin and his ministers had sought to squeeze down the costs of Turenne's army by assuming that the German enterpriser colonels would finance a large part of their operations from their own resources, local contributions, and plunder. But the dispatch of the Duc d'Enghien in both 1644 and 1645, with an army made up predominantly of prestigious French regiments, was a different matter. Politically, Mazarin recognized the importance of the Condé branch of the Bourbon to his political survival, and he had no wish to antagonize Enghien by depriving him of military resources. And also militarily, as I suggested, the assumptions about the costs of running a French army, a properly French army, were very different from a force of German enterpriser colonels. So the preparations to ensure that Enghien's forces in 1644 and 45 were well paid and well supplied were elaborate and expensive. The lavish funding and the very different approach to maintaining what was seen as a French army corps was not missed by Turenne, nor by the German colonels. The resentment that this was to cause lay partially submerged, but was to erupt in 1647 as part of the grievances when the German troops mutinied. The end of the 1645 campaign brought about a reassessment of strategic priorities by Mazarin and a rethinking of operational approaches by Turenne. The results of campaigning in both 1644 and 45 had, as I said, been mixed. Both campaigns had held out the prospect of dazzling military success, followed on from a hard-fought battle, Fribourg and then Allerheim. But in both cases, the territorial gains, the ability to project and keep French troops in the heart of Germany, had proved temporary in the face of strong Bavarian imperial recovery. The immediate goal of French operations, to set up the French army for the winter month in the still relatively prosperous lands of Franconia, Württemberg, even Bavaria, had proved unattainable. Mazarin began now shifting his strategic attention away from a theatre where lasting success had thus seemed elusive, and where the cheap option had proved, of course, thanks to Enghien's forces, anything but cheap. He was distracted by two alternative routes, as he saw it, to placing war-winning pressure on the Habsburgs. The first of these was a dramatic shift of priorities in Italy. I don't want to go into this in detail. It's really much more to do with the previous colloque. But this is Mazarin's decision in 1645-46 to move his offensive from the north of Italy into this amphibious military operation to try to take the Spanish presidios within the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. A campaign which was in preparation throughout the whole of 1645, finally launched in 1646, failed to achieve its initial objective of Orbitello, but managed to grab Piombino towards the end of the campaigning season in 46. The second shift, which I wouldn't tend to dwell on, was far more momentous. Mazarin was lured into enthusiastic support for a project that was to dominate his thinking through 1646 and to some extent beyond. This was a notion possibly first suggested by the Spanish plenipotentiary at Westphalia, Penaranda, that Spain would agree to surrender the Spanish Netherlands, the Pays-Bas, in return for France's abandonment of support for Catalonia and the Catalan rebels. Whether or not Spain was ever serious about such a proposition is questionable. Its main purpose was likely to have been to alarm the Dutch Republic about the prospect of a dramatic expansion of French power on their doorstep. Mazarin, however, took the exchange very seriously and wrote extensively about the project to the French plenipotentiaries at Westphalia, rather than, as hitherto, seeking an indirect strategic approach to exploit Spanish weakness by undermining the Austrian Habsburgs and their allies in the empire, Mazarin now believed that France should turn her military resources to a direct assault on Spain, with the aim of securing the glittering prize of the whole of the Spanish Pays-Bas in return for peace. By 1646, Mazarin was set on this course. A powerful army in Flanders, with Enghien in effective control, was to be given free rein to seize the military initiative and persuade the Spanish to concede the Pays-Bas, rather than seeing it removed from them piecemeal by military operations. That's Mazarin's perspective. At the same time, Turenne had noticed, no less than the French ministers, that the outcome of the two German campaigns of 1644 and 45 fell short of initial hopes. He attributed this largely to the inadequate resourcing of his troops by the Crown. Turenne recognized that despite suffering two major defeats, the Bavarian Imperial Army enjoyed a consistent numerical and operational advantage over the French Army of Germany. The French had not been able to break the hold of these troops on the relatively prosperous central southern German territories, which provided them with recruits, supplies, and financial support. The arrival of Enghien's substantial additional army corps in 1644 and 1645 had provided a temporary advantage that the French had certainly exploited, but it hadn't allowed their gains to be consolidated in a way that decisively threatened the enemy's survival. For Turenne, the alternative means to redress the balance grew increasingly obvious: direct cooperation with the Swedish army in the empire. In 1644, this had been impossible while the Swedes were engrossed in Torstensson's war, the Swedish blitzkrieg against Denmark. In 1645 as well, the Swedes had focused their initial campaign on a strike through Bohemia down into the Habsburg lands. By the time the issues of cooperation with the French started to be considered, Enghien was already linked up with Turenne's forces and pursuing a French strategic agenda. The Swedish government ministers continued, of course, to nurse their grievances dating back to the mid-1630s and to regard the French as essentially untrustworthy and unreliable. But Turenne's Protestantism and his diplomatic initiatives to keep the Swedish High Command aware of his operations made some progress in winning over the Swedish military commanders, notably Torstensson. If Sweden wanted to strike a decisive blow against the Habsburgs and their allies in Germany, then a two-headed offensive in which one Swedish army would assail the Habsburg hereditary lands of Bohemia and Austria, while another army corps, operating together with Turenne's army of Germany, would destroy resistance in central and western Germany, was an appealing strategy. Turenne's initial letters to Mazarin and Le Tellier, proposing that the German campaign of 1646 should be constructed around a joint Franco-Swedish operation, received sympathetic support from the cardinal. This approval gained momentum as the imperial threat intensified to France's one Protestant German ally, the Landgravine of Hesse-Kassel. Turenne proposed a joint campaign with the commander of the Swedish Western Army, Carl Gustav Wrangel. This would firstly see off the threat to Hesse-Kassel and then seek to draw the Bavarian imperial forces into an engagement on equal or superior terms, after which the Swedish and French forces would thrust downwards into Franconia and then Bavaria, seeking to knock the Elector out of the war. Mazarin was enthusiastic about this suggested conjunction. At minimal cost to France, it offered the prospect of saving Hesse-Kassel from being overrun and might offer a military breakthrough in the empire. On 14th of April 1646, Mazarin offered his enthusiastic endorsement of Franco-Swedish military cooperation, and a month later, on the 18th of May 1646, he authorized the junction of Turenne's army with Wrangel's Swedes. But 9 days later, on the 27th of May, Mazarin wrote urgently to Turenne, I quote, qu'il faut user de tous les moyens et inventions possibles pour éviter la dite jonction. Mazarin had dramatically shifted his strategic view, and this letter was followed up with a series of equally urgent letters from Mazarin and under his instructions from the French plenipotentiaries at Westphalia, all urging the same point. Turenne was to double-cross the Swedes and to keep his army away from the agreed rendezvous. Well, how do we explain this? I think by late May 1646, Mazarin was expecting that France, with successes in Italy and Flanders seemingly within grasp, would be in a prime position to secure far greater benefits from the general European peace settlement ongoing at Westphalia. One reason for this hopefulness was that Sweden, by 1646, had already staked out her own war demands as one of the military victors of the war, and these demands had been established within the peace negotiations. Mazarin's new concern was that a highly successful joint military campaign in the empire, involving, for example, the invasion and occupation of Bavaria, would give the Swedes a lever at the Westphalian negotiations to renegotiate their position with a series of new demands. Not only might these put Sweden into a position to increase her influence and control of the empire at French expense, one of D'Avau's, of course, general preoccupations, but a whole raft of new Swedish demands could undermine France's bid to impose the Catalonia-Pays-Bas exchange, now that the Allied demands appeared more and more extreme. Mazarin, believing the exchange was as good as agreed, was concerned that any shift in the military situation of the empire would disturb the present French favourable equilibrium that was going on in the negotiations. This shift by Mazarin was, of course, terrible news for Turenne. Avoiding the rendezvous with Sweden deprived Turenne's small army of any prospect of taking the offensive in Germany. Indeed, Mazarin's instructions urged Turenne to consider instead an invasion of Spanish Luxembourg to intensify the pressure on the Spanish to formalize the exchange. But it also involved Turenne breaking his word to Wrangel and the Swedes and abandoning the plans for the campaign. As Turenne and his army waited on the west bank of the Rhine, the tensions with the Swedes grew. Wrangel openly threatened to abandon the campaign, while making scarcely veiled threats that the Swedes would use this provocation to make a separate peace with the emperor. Turenne sought to hold the situation together, and the slender thread which prevented total breakdown was the presence of some German recruits which had been raised for Turenne, which the Comte de Tracy had led not to Turenne's army, but into the Swedish camp in July, and which served as a kind of proxy for the presence of the entire French force. Meanwhile, Turenne and his supporters at court desperately tried to persuade Mazarin to reconsider his position, pointing to the disastrous impact that non-performance of the military agreement would have on Franco-Swedish relations. Finally, and equally suddenly, Mazarin reconsidered, recognized the risks he was taking, and a series of frantic messages in early July ordered Turenne to follow the original plan and rendezvous with the Swedes. Despite the fact that Mazarin's strategic imperatives and his hesitation had cost Turenne and Wrangel nearly half a campaign season, what followed, partly due to the remarkable errors of their enemies, which is another story, was the most spectacular and successful campaign of the German war. By late September, both the French and the Swedish armies had burst into a virtually undefended Bavaria, and during the next month they ravaged their way as far as the gates of Munich. As the memoir of late 1643 had so presciently argued, Elector Maximilian would never tolerate the devastation of his own state, and in March 1647 he signed the Truce of Ulm, taking Bavaria out of the war. So almost in spite of Mazarin's hesitancy, Turenne, in alliance with the Swedes, had all but won the war in the empire by the end of 1646. The presence of victorious Franco-Swedish troops on the borders of Bavaria and across central Germany, the neutralization of Bavaria, all made the prospect of waging further war in the empire practically futile for the imperials. The pressures to finalize a peace settlement were overwhelming. Mazarin, however, had not given up on his project to gain the Spanish Pays-Bas. The campaign of 1646, jointly conducted by Gaston d'Orléans and Enghien, had proved spectacularly successful, adding Courtrai, Mardyk and Dunkirk to the tally of cities captured. Despite, and to some extent because of, the predictably alarmed Dutch response at the prospect of having the French on their southern frontiers, Mazarin decided that the French strategy in 1647 would double down on his military operations in the Spanish Pays-Bas. Assuming that the military situation in Germany was now stabilized, that peace was barely months away, in February 1647, Mazarin started suggesting to Turenne that the army of Germany should be pulled out of Germany and redeployed in the forthcoming campaign in Luxembourg, and if need be, to back up the other French forces in the Spanish Pays-Bas. In fact, the final order to move the army of Germany into Luxembourg and Flanders wasn't given until early June. But the effect, once the orders were given, was much more rapid. Around the 18th of June, Turenne started to get reports of serious unrest amongst the German regiments and their refusal to serve outside of Germany. Initial information came to Turenne from Colonel Reinhard Rosen, who presented himself as a loyalist, trying to manage a surge of unrest amongst the ordinary soldiers. But it soon became apparent that this was a concerted and officer-led mutiny by a substantial proportion of the army, indeed all the German cavalry regiments, the best troops serving in the army. Turenne seems to have exacerbated the situation by arresting Rosen, but in fact he had no practical means to stop the mutiny. It was clear, and extensive documentation about the mutiny survives in the Correspondance Politique in the Affaires étrangères, that the trigger for the mutiny was the order to move across the Rhine and into Luxembourg. But what one sees in the extended demands and discussions surrounding the mutiny is a series of extensive demands and criticisms brought by the mutineers, adding up, in effect, to a full-scale indictment of the management of the army of Germany since 1644, in which neither Turenne nor the French government escapes deep censure. Having treated the army as a cheap and negotiable part of his grand strategy, Mazarin's order to cross the frontiers had finally tipped the balance, and years of pent-up exasperation about negligence and poor treatment exploded into mutiny. The result was that a portion of the cavalry regiments passed definitively into Swedish service, and a further portion of the army was crippled by losing large numbers of long-serving veterans to desertion. The chaos of the mutiny dominated the months of campaigning and disastrously soured relations between the French and the Swedes, as the latter accepted the mutinous cavalry regiments into Swedish service and rewarded their officers. The collapse of Allied military cooperation emboldened the Bavarians to tear up the Ulm Truce in early September, rejoining the Imperials to reassert control in southern Germany. In January 1648, Spain and the Dutch Republic signed, as we know, a separate peace treaty at Münster, and Spain withdrew from the peace negotiations with France. The poisonous legacy of Mazarin's great hopes for the exchange of Catalonia and the Spanish Netherlands hung over the last few months of the war in the empire. So just in form of conclusion, perhaps specifically about Mazarin, what does the conduct of the war in the empire tell us about Mazarin's statesmanship? Perhaps an interesting topic here. Well, those I think who've seen Mazarin as a foreign policy realist avant la lettre, a skilled and consistent exponent of balance of power diplomacy, I think need to look more broadly at the character traits of the man himself. Heady ambition and wishful thinking, as much as realpolitik, informed Mazarin's grand strategy. Yet the dramatic reversals of his strategy in, say, 1645 and 1646, and the obvious incompatibilities between his aspirations for campaigning in the empire and the resources committed to sustaining it, are perhaps less surprising in the broader context of the cardinal's actions. He was always prone to mercurial and changeable judgments. Take one example. In 1 week in 1651, Mazarin could, for example, regard Jean-François Paul de Gondi, the later Cardinal Cardinal de Retz as his greatest enemy, and the next week could see Gondi suitably rewarded as a trustworthy figure who would facilitate Mazarin's return from exile. So this isn't totally unusual in Mazarin's thinking. And Mazarin's phenomenal administrative range and rapid grasp of problems had its downside in his much commented reluctance to delegate even modest administrative tasks, and his more serious reluctance to pay much attention to the opinions and advice of others. At one level, he was prepared to give Turenne freedom to make decisions while actively on campaign and to accept the consequences of that, something Richelieu never accepted with his generals. But in matters of grand strategy, he operated with minimal reference to others, and his own intellect became a means of reinforcing his ideas ever more stringently. In this case, it meant choosing a series of unforced errors against the advice of his best general. Thank you very much.